We're going to have a great panel today, in large part because we're talking amongst friends. Wendy and Nathan are two people I've come to really admire over the last couple of years as I've worked in this space. They are clear-eyed, they understand the challenges of what they are trying to do, but they are yet still filled with so much inspiration about their mission. And I'm hoping today we get a chance to really get into that and have a chance for them to showcase to you all the great things that I've seen over the years about how dedicated they are to things like preservation and, more importantly, being partisans, I would say, about the movement towards Web3 and a form of a decentralized internet. So I'm going to begin today just by asking the panelists to tell us a little bit about their organizations and in particular why you think that storing content is so very important. And so we'll start there, talk for about 15 minutes, and then I'll turn it over to the audience where we'll be able to do another 15 minutes worth of Q&A. So Wendy, let's begin with you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Wendy Hanamura, and I am the Director of Partnerships for the Internet Archive. If those of you who don't know us, we are one of the world's largest digital libraries. Many people know us for the Wayback Machine, 470 billion web pages stored and getting harder every day. But we also offer universal access to books and music. And, so for us, storage is our life because long ago, 24 years ago, our founder, Brewster Kahle, thought, you know what, this web, this might actually amount to something. We should be saving this because someday we're going to need to look back on it. And that has been our mission for these many years.
Great. Nathan, why don't you jump in and tell us a little bit about the Guardian project?
Sure. And I'm really honored to be here with you as well, and Wendy from the Internet Archive, which has been a long inspiration. The boldness of that vision that they've maintained and continue to expand upon is very much intertwined with the work we've done at Guardian Project for 10 years. We began with this realization that mobile phones, smartphones were becoming kind of the key place that people were communicating, were organizing, were capturing important content and media for their own advocacy and rights preservation, and be they sort of frontline activists or just everyday people, that we needed to work to improve the privacy and security of these devices. So that was kind of a founding principle of like, how do we make communications more secure, right? And so we worked in the early days with trying to bring things like Tor and PGP and off-the-record encryption to smartphones. We worked with Moxie and Signal in their very early days when it was just an idea. And so we took on the Tor and PGP, and he took on encrypted text messaging. And now we both have millions of users using Tor and encrypted communications every day. And we've continued with this idea of building blocks. So we worked on things like SQL Cipher for encrypting databases on mobile devices. But then we've had this kind of higher level vision of, well, what's new beyond just kind of the expected, I want to have privacy. And the idea that all of these sensors combined with a camera creates kind of a smart camera that is producing this whole other level of metadata that can help you verify any picture or video, add that extra weight when you are using it for advocacy. And we've worked on that with groups like Witness, a great human rights organization, with Jonathan's efforts out of Stanford and the Starling Project, and with great collaborators like Harlow Holmes from Freedom of the Press Foundation, who always inspired me when she was a student with some of her work on this, creating things like Bigger Brother that led to the work we're doing. So really, what's possible that wasn't before? And I think decentralized storage, things like Filecoin, is that next thing that's like, wow, that's now possible too. So I'm so excited to be here to talk about that.
Great. Well, so I'm going to split our conversation in this part of the Q&A into two parts. Let's first talk about preservation, and then the second we can talk about is authentication. I think those are two related but distinct tasks. So Wendy, first, let's begin with you and talk a little bit about preservation and the contents of preservation. So if you had the ability to store 100x more content than you can today, what would the Internet Archive do with that capability?
Well, let me put it into a little context. Right now, the Internet Archive has about 60 petabytes of data, and we replicate that 3 times across different continents. So, much more than that, but 60 unique petabytes. So, if we had 600 petabytes, what would we do? Approaching exabyte territory, right? Well, for one thing, the Wayback Machine that we all love and use every day, we can't keep up with social media, especially social media that is primarily video based, which is huge in terms of storage. So we're getting a lot of Twitter, we're getting some YouTube, but Instagram, TikTok, everything else out there, we are not keeping. And I've got to believe that in 100 years, we're going to want to look back and say, hey, what was that Jonathan Dotan thinking? And if we don't have all your social media, we're going to be really not serving history well.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
on top of that volume of data and all that we're producing, like not just what we see, but it's all almost what we don't see as well. All of the signals, all of the it's this weird thing that our focus has been on like obscuring. We had this app called Obscuracam, which removed and destroyed visual pixels, but now we're about, we should save everything, but we want to save it in a way that's like in our control and that's private and that, is meaningful, and not save it for, advertising and just training AI models and things. So it's this funny balance where like, there is so much more data that when we enabled this engine that captured as much possible data when you were taking a photo as possible. And we could see when you were like flicking your wrist to take the picture, and there was a unique fingerprint for everyone's picture movement. And it was this moment of like, wow, there's a lot of information we're not saving, but it made us very nervous. A, how would we store that? Because we're going to run out of space. And B, how do we protect it when we do store it? So
Jonathan, I wanted you to jump in here too, because you are as much a participant in this whole world as we are. Tell us about the Starling project and that vital video. What would you do if you had 10 times more storage?
Oh, that's a good question. So for those of you who don't know about the Starling project, we focus on the records of sensitive records that document human rights abuses, or the survivors of genocides who talk about the triumph of certain human rights. And I really think, Wendy, there's something fascinating about what you're talking about YouTube. And I just, maybe we can focus on that. It's a large data set, obviously. Video is heavier than other forms of data. And I think what we're finding in conflict zones in particular is that YouTube has become this incredible archive already about what's going on in conflict areas. And yet there are still huge problems with preserving information that gets put onto YouTube. And if that was done within an ethical framework where everyone understood what the rules were about that preservation, and then it could be used for things like accountability, that would be transformative. And right now, there are efforts that YouTube is attempting to do, but it is informal. It's based on who you know at YouTube, et cetera.
yeah.
That's a balance of power that I think should be fundamentally changed. And so,
And I can talk about a current event that was, this tragedy that just happened in Nigeria with the protests against the hashtag End SARS, which is essentially saying this kind of secret police that's killing people extrajudicially in Nigeria. It killed protesters, peaceful protesters. And what I immediately did is reached out to some of collaborators we have in Nigeria who are lawyers and said, you need to go and scrape YouTube and WhatsApp and Twitter. You have to go and like extract this stuff out, which is often lo-fi, and you're not getting all the metadata. And I said, you need to do timestamps and screen cap, and basically schooling them on how to create some sort of like preservable snapshot of this incident, because that is what will be sent to the International Criminal Court in The Hague to like get these, horrific people who killed them. But it's such a reverse, weird, hacky, scrapey process, unfortunately, still now. And so we need, that can't be what we want.
and Nathan, I would add, and then can turn it back over to Wendy, it's also a violation of the terms of service of these platforms. So that's a whole issue that, is only now really going to be addressed in the Supreme Court next year, which is whether or not scraping is legal under certain circumstances. Wendy, I'm going to turn it back to you with an interesting kind of vaunt back, which is I was reading a legal textbook that was talking about the admissibility of evidence. The Wayback Machine is mentioned as a best practice that, if you want to admit something into evidence, if you can show that it was actually archived on the Wayback Machine, that's a third party, which can help establish some provenance and some credibility around the fact that, yes, this video was taken at this time and place, if that's, let's say, hypothetically what we're looking at. So I was pleased that once that the next generation of lawyers are being pushed back to folks like the Internet Archive, who I know are great stewards of information, but maybe you want to talk to folks here about what does it mean to be a guardian of that type of information, having that type of responsibility?
We would be the first to tell you that the Wayback Machine is just a hack, right? It's a hack because the way we created the web, Tim Berners-Lee, our good friend, did a great job, but it was very simple. There could have been a time axis. There can be a time axis where we do verifiable time-stamped versions of the web as it changes. And because we don't have that third axis, we do the Wayback Machine and we try and gather as much as we can, but we're falling behind. We have this little statue, you've probably seen it, Jonathan, where we said, okay, in 1997, if you put everything on the web in a box, what would it look like? So we have this box where you can see every single web page, and it was at that point 2.5 terabytes big. Now no one entity can contain it, can store it. It's growing beyond our capacity. So that's why the Internet Archive has been involved in decentralized web conversations since 2015, because we think that there's a whole new infrastructure like IPFS, Protocol Labs, and Filecoin that could do something more than the hack of the Wayback Machine.
So let me take the audience now with the remaining couple of minutes we have with our Q&A into really the other side of this coin. The preservation is one part, authentication is the second. And Filecoin is unique in many ways in terms of the level of its cryptographic proofs. And really what that's doing is it's providing a method of authentication that storage is happening and that there are then proofs of space-time and proofs of replication to prove the integrity of all that. I guess, Nathan, I want to start with you because you've worked on these issues. You have storage apps and you've worked with a variety of different projects there. Your work is all open source. And so let's talk a little bit about where does authentication sit and what are the methods of authentication that are, in your mind, the best?
I can just walk you through briefly what we do with our proof mode library and app. We gather a bundle of metadata from sensors and hashes and PGP signatures when you capture a video or a photo at the point of capture. So there's a certain level of authentication right there. This includes authenticating the hardware, that this isn't a modified device. You have some trust in the hardware, so that's key. And I know there's been some Bitcoin phones from HTC and others that have been interesting there. And Google also offers some ability to authenticate the hardware through their Play Services stack. So then the next piece you have, from there, we offer the ability to do a few things. You can take that bundle and then tweet out a hash of it. And so Twitter is kind of a funny kind of chain to publish stuff to. And then we also have some proprietary notarization services. Google has one and others where you're essentially doing a private kind of sharing there. You could also share it to a Signal group, right, with lots of people that maybe has a lawyer on it or an actual digital notary who could print it out, not a human notary. So you could use peer-to-peer and private communications. But then we also can integrate and post stuff through the archive.org via their S3-like API and post that metadata there into their sort of buckets. And lastly, we are working with real blockchain-based systems like open timestamps or now with Filecoin and other pieces where you're really pushing out to this more diverse community that can attest that this stuff existed at this time from this known place. So I think that shows where we're still experimenting, like at which layer should this exist. I think you could also probably write an IP packet where you injected a hash of something and it would get logged in a router somewhere, or, there's a lot of ways you could authenticate things. So we wish it was like many things, like TLS, like most internet security, it's an add-on, right? It's at a layer higher than the internet. Maybe IPv8 or something, or 12 will have something built in. But for now, we're putting authentication in everywhere we can.
Jonathan, I know you've thought a lot about this. What are your thoughts on open standards and authentication?
I, it's interesting. Both Nathan and Wendy represent, I'd say, two big pillars in how you deal with authentication, because Nathan has put forward a set of tooling, which is, as he's described, interoperable. And then Wendy, you've provided through the Internet Archive a great model for being able to have, first of all, a destination that has the integrity of the Internet Archive, but then also as leaders of the decentralized web movement, you've been pushing for a variety of people to come in there and do that. What I'd say, and I talked a little bit about this yesterday, is that it's the combination of these two things which is so powerful. If you can create a web of knowledge that allows you to do both storage and authentication in a fully decentralized manner, that allows for things like adversarial interoperability and all the good stuff that allows for creating robust webs of knowledge, what that allows you to do is to start to build a coalition of people that can stand up for authenticity. But critically, no one entity is like the linchpin. It remains decentralized over time. And so I think that's part of the big message that I'm working on, is that in the rush to decentralization, you don't want to create new forms of de facto centralization. Like, to me, the worst possible thing would be that out of all this, there's like a single layer of truth that emerges. Like that would just be Orwellian in its nature. So I think what fascinates me about this, and I think we'll turn it now over to some questions in the audience, is that this is as much about a frame of mind and a philosophy and an ethic as it is a piece of technology. And you really have to do both. So great, I'm going to turn it over to some folks in the audience, and feel free. I'm seeing here in the QA box, there's a couple of things. So let's go ahead and start with Barack's first question. It says, Google indexes everything, not just the web, but blockchain networks and probably Filecoin and IPFS as well. How might we prevent a re-centralization from such actors? So let's go ahead and begin. I think, Wendy, you guys sit at some of these, the confluence of a lot of these discussions here at the Internet Archive. So talk a little bit about that in terms of some of the benefits that you have from the big players, and also some things we need to be careful about.
This is one of the hard ones, right? I mean, decentralized storage is hard in a couple of ways. One is if everything is encrypted and distributed, if you start to store bad stuff, child pornography and other things, what's to stop this network from serving bad actors? And the other one is what everyone's questions. We're building this decentralized web, but what are the forces, the economic forces that will prevent one player, perhaps even, someone in our midst, from becoming dominant, just as Google has become? I don't have an answer for that. We have been always dedicated to a web with many winners. And so within the power of the Internet Archive, we try to lift up a variety of players and create a platform for many voices. We have a set of principles for the decentralized web that we ask people to sign on to. But the economic model question that creates a Google, that's a really hard one. I open it up to my fellow panelists and folks in the chat.
Well, Nathan, I think you have dealt with this a lot with Tor in creating alternative networks and whatnot. So talk a little bit about how you deal with things. The question was specifically answering about indexing, and then there's another question about discoverability. So let me kind of just see if you can launch us into that. Like, how do you deal with that user interface issue and just the critical need to discover things and yet still keep things decentralized?
We've been actually working with Matrix a lot, the Matrix protocol, which is, very much a federated, decentralized vision for secure messaging. And I think it does come down to on what Google had. Part of it is user experience. You go to a box and you ask it something. And Matrix really does an excellent job of, you're just in a chat room. I'm in a room. It's about a thing. I talk to people. I don't know which server they're on. I don't know where they are. I don't have to worry about things. I just talk in a room. And yet people could be on a variety of infrastructures in different places. And the same with kind of searching for messages and sharing media. It's very seamless. It feels like you're on one of these closed, centralized silo chats, but it's not. So I think that's a big part of it. And second is going back to, Sir Tim's vision of the web, and then what was missing, there was a lot missing from the concept of a search engine really wasn't part of it, but it was needed. And so I think if we think about we spend a lot of time with user stories, and these user story boards that we produce are really meant to center us on the people's problems we're trying to solve who we don't know. And so one thing we figured out, for instance, was that if you're working with folks in other countries where they don't have unlimited data plans, you have to think about how many hours do they have to work to earn a gigabyte of data, right? And so if you do that, then you're kind of centered on a mindset of what's really needed. So in this case, when we're talking about how do we avoid someone coming in and re-centralizing, well, we have to say, well, what is it that the human users, the people, the beneficiaries are tapping into that gives them that power? So I think we should stay centered on the users. I know like Filecoin and IPFS and all this stuff is so awesome to geek out on and just be like, this is amazing. Look at all the, what we can do. But we need to keep it human. And because humans sometimes just want a scratch itch and they're like, I don't know, this thing works. I'm going to go use this, re-centralized IPFS instead of the original decentralized version. They don't care.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
I would argue, well, I actually had a thought of bringing things back to a prototype that you guys built, which is that I think one of the big things is thinking about bridges. And Wendy, I was so amazed to see that you guys have already started to engage with decentralized protocols, and yet it's still on the internet as we know it today. It's still on internet, so it's archive.org, right? And so, I think one thought and then a question for you all, which is what are those key bridges that could allow us to get from where we are today to the future? And I think that one of those might be just really clear and inspiring use cases for this. So there was a second part to Thad's question, which was about what are some of the wild ideas of stuff that you'd love to see? Wendy, you mentioned that there's some treasures that you've already put on Filecoin now, and what are some things that excite you in the future that could be iconic things that can bring people over to discover stuff in the decentralized web?
Our friends at Protocol Labs, they love those rockets. And so it doesn't surprise me that this is Filecoin liftoff week. So in the payload of that rocket, we have all of the books of LibriVox. That's 14,000 plus projects in 100 different languages, audiobooks read from the public domain. We also put all of Prelinger's films, 17,000 educational home movie, Warner Brothers stock footage onto that payload. These we could do because they are open access. They are, in many cases, public domain. We also, are talking with this community. What else should we be putting up there? Maybe we have it. Maybe you need to upload it to us. If you do, we have started a new project between Internet Archive and Filecoin called Filecoin Archives. So you can tweet with that hashtag Filecoin Archives. Juan put out a tweet and you can respond to his. Tell us what you think we should be saving right now. One idea that we have is we have culled out of the Wayback Machine 9.1 million open access scientific journal articles. We could be putting that up there. Rights issues are still a question, right? We'd love to put just everything we have up there, but it needs to be open.
Well, and
oh, sorry, go ahead, Nathan, please.
Going back to the use of Wayback Machine for legal authentication. At Berkman Klein Center through the library lab, there's the perma.cc project. And this is kind of a version of the Wayback that's really meant to be used to avoid bit rot and kind of, capturing something for a legal opinion. And there's really amazing work going on with the web archive format files and that use. And I think, there's the sort of, mass cultural treasures that we all love and adore and are, that the archive has done. And then there's, these one snapshot important moment things that need to be saved, because they're part of a legal opinion that will matter in 300 years, as well. And so that kind of, being around like the Harvard Law Library, you realize how those things do matter. And if a link rots and no one can find it, then you'll be like, oh, I don't understand this opinion anymore because I can't find the link to this thing. So those things are also so key.
You asked me, Jonathan, what I would do if I had 100 times more storage. I think I'd be remiss if I didn't say that even with our best efforts at the Internet Archive and our 100 different library partners, we are not as global, as diverse, as inclusive as we need to be. No library is. And, we draw our materials often from libraries, which have their own problems with the isms, right? Sexism, elitism, racism. So we need to really reach out across the globe. This is going to be Filecoin archives stored across the globe. We need to look for sources of information that are global and not the usual things we think about.
Well, I think if I've understood Filecoin's mission as it's emerged out of things like IPFS, it's not just this globe, but interplanetary ambitions. I think were on the team's mind when they got started. Well, with the last 3 minutes, I think that I want to just to pose a question to you both, just because you've dealt with these issues about trust, and what are the hopeful message that you can offer about ways in which we can restore trust to digital media? Certainly it's been on my mind, and I think many people that are here. We have now this election, which is going to be happening in just around the corner. And even if we get some answers on election day, I think there's ample reason to fear about how trust could break down after the election, worse than it has already. So to put a positive outlook on things, what are the things that you see that are giving you hope on how to restore trust online?
Well, I think all the efforts of everyone working on tackling this problem, because it's not, the answer isn't, we're going to go back to, the nightly news who says this is the truth. What we're trying to do is remember that the people have the power and that we need to give them tools within communities of trust that already exist, human communities, be it activist groups, churches, schools, professions, to exchange and authenticate information within themselves, to build up these trusts, right? And to give them better workflows and better tooling to do that. And then that builds from there, right? And so going back to my friend Nana in Nigeria, who I'm trying to help authenticate this media, this terrible killing, reaching out to her and connecting her to communities who can build this trust that is evidence that will prosecute people for terrible crimes. So we're just trying to make that workflow happen. And there's so many smart people working on it, from, yourselves at Starling to the others in the Content Authentication Initiative to the archive and others providing the infrastructure for storage. So that really gives me hope that there's so many smart, caring people involved.
Wendy?
At the Internet Archive, we like to say that the answer to misinformation is context. Context, context, context. So that's what we've been trying to do with our resources. We've been working night and day with our friends over at Wikipedia so that every time there's a footnote in a Wikipedia article, it's backed up automatically into the Wayback Machine. So if that link breaks, you can go back to the source. We're now working with their footnotes that lead to books. We can take you to the exact page, the exact sentence that purports to support that fact. And so now when you hit a footnote in Wikipedia, boom, you hit the click and it takes you to the book in the Internet Archive, the right page. Those are small steps, but we're trying to buttress people's abilities to dig for themselves access drives preservation. If you make things accessible to people, they will take care of it. So that's why all of our archives are publicly accessible.
Amazing. Well, this session has delivered exactly as I had hoped in terms of all the levels of inspiration that we were hoping to tap into. For those of you who are new to what the work that the folks at the Internet Archive are doing, or what the Guardian Project are doing, I really urge you to go to their websites. They are truly models of all the great things that are going on. Over at Starling, we continue to work with both these entities precisely because of that model that they provide us. So I urge everyone to do the same. And yeah, and if you have questions, continue to engage.